Well, welcome. We are going to now look at the rest of the axial skeleton. We had just looked at the skull, and so now this is our little skeletal model here. I'm up at the campus, and I'll use this. Now remember that there's two portions of the skeleton, the axial and the appendicular. So if I was to take our little skull model and put it here and kind of complete the whole thing, the axial skeleton is the skull, the vertebral column, and then the rib cage. So if we looked at it, our vertebral column, if I come around here, this is a look at it from the posterior side. There's a chain of 24 movable bones that rests on this fused bone called the sacrum down here in this area. And so that's that is what we call the axial skeleton. So I want to look at the vertebrae individually. So there's three areas of, or three sections of the vertebral column. You have, quit wobbling, you have the cervical, the thoracic. Actually, I had it back, I had it kind of unorganized there. The cervical, the thoracic, and the lumbar. So if I'm looking back at our guy here, the area that we would consider the neck, this is the cervical. This area that's in the middle back is called the thoracic. And then finally, this area down here is called the lumbar. And so a typical vertebrae, there's a couple parts that you'll need to know. And I'll just kind of use this as one of them. Now, two big parts to it. This is the body of the vertebrae. This is the largest part. If I look at it here, you can see it on this one as well. So this is the body of the vertebrae, and remember that it is called the body of the vertebrae. There are other bones that we're going to look at that will have things called bodies, so you have to be very specific on that. The other one is this hole. This is the vertebral foramen. This is going to be the hole where the spinal cord is going to be located. So the spinal cord will run through this little list of holes. So we've got the body of the vertebrae, the vertebral foramen, and then we're going to have some things that extend off of the vertebrae. And I'm going to kind of use this one because up here you can kind of see it from this point. There's going to be two that go from side to side. Now remember, a plane that runs across the body is called the transverse plane, sometimes called the horizontal, but the transverse plane in general. So these are called transverse processes because they stick out to the side of the vertebrae. And then we have this one that sticks back, and that's called the spinous process. So if I go back over to this, these things right here, all this that are poking back, they're the spinous processes. So if you feel on your behind your neck, those are the spinous processes you feel. So to give a little recap, and there's a few others that I'll talk about here in just a second, but we got the body of the vertebrae, the vertebral foramen, or the vertebral foramen. We've got two transverse processes on either side, and then the spinous process. Now, if I look at this close, you're going to see a couple little parts. There's a connection between the transverse process and the body, and then a connection between the spinous process and the transverse process. The one that is here, all right, this is called a lamina. The lamina is between the spinous process and the transverse process. The one that is here is called a pedicle, between the transverse process and the body. So there was a mnemonic when I was in school that helped me remember this. Starting with the S here, spinous process. Some love to play ball. Some love to play ball. Some, spinous process, love, lamina. Two, transverse process, play, pedicle, ball, body of the vertebrae. So that was a little thing that kind of helped me as we were going along. So, but you're required to know those parts. There's other parts to the vertebrae that you're not required to know right now, but they'll come in handy as we go along. So there's a potential that you're going to have a look of these to kind of decide, and you can kind of see, I'm going to point out this one, that this is going to be the thoracic vertebrae, and you can see it doesn't want to sit up because its its spinous process, if you can see it here, is very angled. It doesn't come back, and that's going to be our point straight back. And that's going to be kind of an important feature I'm going to talk about here in a second. Now, there's going to potentially be a question of you seeing a vertebra and you deciding what section of the spine it's going to go through, be from. And there's really two questions that divide all of these into what they are. The very first one is pretty straightforward. The cervical spine actually has foramen in the transverse processes. So this is called the transverse foramen. You can see it on this model here. If you look closely, I'm trying to get, so there's a artery and a vein that run through here, and it's only found in the cervical spine. So if you're looking at a vertebrae and you're trying to decide what section it's from, if you see transverse foramen, you don't have to ask any other questions. That's a cervical vertebrae. Now, if I don't have transverse foramen, then there's a lot of other questions that you can ask to see, but the main one is going to concern that spinous process. The spinous process, if I come down here, the spinous process on the thoracic spine, you should be able to tell, is very angled. It's going to come straight down. Now, that's not for all thoracic vertebrae, but it is for most of them. The other one, the lumbar, is going to come straight back. Now, if I was to come back over here and look again, you would be able to tell that once it passes here, it's going to start angling down a lot. Now, of course, in the area between the thoracic spine and the lumbar spine, when you get close to it, there's going to be some commonalities that'll be there, and there's other specific things. But right now, we're just looking at general ideas. So the two questions, one, is there holes in the transverse process called transverse foramen? If there is, it's a cervical vertebrae. You've got to go no farther. That's what you've got. If it's not, then you look at the spinous process. Is the spinous process really angled, or is it relatively straight back? If it's angled, it is the thoracic spine. If it is straight back, it is the lumbar spine. So that's a real pretty basic way to tell the difference. I have heard, I had people when I was in school, I'm a chiropractor, and so we got to study a lot of these. And I had one professor who was like, oh, look, it's a monkey, a giraffe, and a rhinoceros. And I just thought, wow, that's a interesting look. But and I've had people say, well, small, medium, big. But if I just have one and I'm looking at it, it's hard to tell if that's small, medium, or big. Size is kind of relative. So those are the three things that I would recommend, or the two questions I would recommend that pretty much divide all three sections apart. Now, in the vertebral column, what will happen is there are, you need to know this, there are 7 cervical vertebrae, there are 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. You can remember that you have breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, and dinner at 5. Now, nobody really follows that, but that's a good rule of thumb. So another thing you'll see when we get into the thoracic cage, the rib cage, that there are 12 pair of ribs. Each one of the thoracic vertebrae have a pair of ribs that come off of it. So you can have, if you can remember one, you can remember both, hopefully. So they're named going down, so it would be the general name, and we're going to look at the top 2 bones in the cervical spine in just a second and see that they're unique. But in general, it is C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, and then after C7, then we go T1, T2, down to T12, and then from T12, you go L1 down to L5. So if you've ever heard someone say, I've got an L5 disc issue or whatever, that's what they're referring to. So they're generally named, again, for the letter of the area where it is and the number going down. There is a unique pair at the very top. So the top 2 cervical vertebrae are very unique, and they have unique names. Now, the very first one, this one right here, this is called Atlas. Atlas is C1. Now, you'll need to know it as atlas. Atlas is unique in the fact that it does not have a vertebral body. It's pretty much one big hoop. It still has the transverse foramen, but it doesn't really have a spinous process, and it doesn't have a vertebral body. That is something to kind of notice with that. Now, in mythology, there was a titan that held up the world, and his name was Atlas. Now, most of these things are Greek or Latin as they get named, and so they named this Atlas because this is what held up your skull. Now, you don't have to know this on here, but this little indentation here, this is where those occipital condyles that you learned in the skull rest on. Now, the C2 is a unique one because it has this special little extension that comes off of it. Now, this is called the dens, all right? So this is what happens. The dens actually fits into the place where the body of C1 should be. So it fits into here, right? And now this is a unique thing because this becomes a pivot point. This is where most of your rotation in your cervical spine, so if you shake your head no, most of the rotation that's happening is around this little pivot point. Now, in science, a pivot point is generally referred to as an axis. The name of this bone is axis for that very reason. This is the axis of rotation. This dens is the axis of rotation. So I've got C1 and C2, and they have unique names that you have to know. Atlas and axis. Atlas because it is holding up your head. Axis because it is the point of rotation. In particular, this little part called the dens. Now, the vertebral column is going to rest on a very unique looking bone. This is called the sacrum. The sacrum is 5 vertebrae that have been fused together, and it is a very unique looking bone. To me, it looks like a prehistoric mastodon head or some kind of weird face mask from early times. But this area right here is the sacrum, and then finally this little section here is called the coccyx. I don't know if anybody in here has ever injured your coccyx. It happens in childbirth, but a lot of times it happens in high school kids that are very active, and they fall and they land on their quote unquote tailbone. And let me tell you, for something that doesn't seem like it has a lot of stuff, this can be debilitating. To break this or to injure that, that's where you have to go around and carry that donut of shame because you can't sit down. And again, unfortunately, that happens in high school where peer pressure and stuff really makes that accentuated. So those are parts of the vertebral column. Again, 24 movable bones resting on this sacrum, which has 5 fused bones, and then this one part that we generally call the coccyx, which most people will call the tailbone. So now we look at the last part of the axial skeleton, the rib cage. So the rib cage is this little cage that's designed to protect the lungs and the heart. And so there are 12 pair of ribs, and I'm going to use this, and a lot of times I guess when I'm in class I always think it looks like some prehistoric like lobster or something. But anyway, sorry, I shouldn't do that, but I always think that's funny. What this is the sternum, this part here, and then the costal cartilage, so you can see it. Now the sternum, there's made up of 3 bones. All 3 of them together are called the sternum, but we have 3 parts to it. This top part is called the manubrium. This part that's the largest part here is called the body of the sternum, and you have to put of the sternum. And then finally, this bottom part here is called the xiphoid process. Now, these 3 work together again to form what we call the sternum. Now, the ribs, again, we said there are 12 pair of ribs, and they are organized into 2 distinct sections. And if I come here, you can kind of see, if I'm looking at them coming in, rib 1 comes directly into the sternum, rib 2 directly into the sternum, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then you see 7 comes in. But after 7, the other ones kind of hitch a ride, and you can kind of see it right here. So the first 7 ribs are called true ribs because they have a distinct connection to the sternum. So if I've got 7 ribs that are true ribs, hopefully that makes easy math to know that there are 5 other pair of ribs, and they're called false ribs. They're false ribs because they don't connect directly to the sternum. Now, in that group of 5 false ribs, there are 2 very special ribs, and they're called floating ribs. And hopefully you can see them here. They do not come around and touch anything. I've got one here and one here. These are referred to as floating ribs. Now, while they're under the umbrella of false ribs, they are more specifically called floating ribs. So this is an overview of the vertebral column and the thoracic cage, which is the last part of, or the second part of the axial skeleton. Take care.